In this chapter, we're going to look in detail at the composition of substances. And by composition, we mean what chemicals make up a given substance and in what percentage. We're going to be using this information a lot throughout this chapter, but let's look at some of the applications in our everyday life. For people who are on a sodium-restricted diet, knowing how much sodium is in table salt is critical. The amount of iron in an iron ore needed for steel production is very necessary in the business world. And if we were looking at using hydrogen for fuel, how much hydrogen can we get out of water, which is H2O? And it is the chlorine in Freon that allows ozone depletion to occur. How much chlorine is in Freon? All these questions can actually be simply answered through a few simple calculations. However, these are calculations that we don't normally do in our everyday life. So I'm going to give you an everyday example that will illustrate the principle we're going to be using throughout this chapter. So here's our everyday example. If I go to a hardware store needing a certain number of nails for a given project, and the hardware store sells nails by the pound, how do I know how many nails I'm buying when I buy a pound of nails? Nails are tiny and it takes a lot of time to count them out, so it's much easier to sell them by the pound. However, unless I know how many are in a pound, I'm not going to know how many I'm getting. So here we need a relationship between number, how many nails, and mass. This is a conversion that we are going to need for atoms or ions. Atoms are so incredibly small, trillions times smaller than this nail. We wouldn't have enough time in a lifetime to count the number of atoms in a pencil dot. So we've got to have a way that we can actually know how many atoms are in a given substance. And the way we're going to do that is a conversion factor that takes us from number to mass. So let's look at our everyday example. Here is our question. A hardware store customer buys 2.6 pounds of nails. A dozen nails has a mass of 0.15 pounds. How many nails did the customer buy? Okay, so let's write out our given and our wanted. I'm given 2.6 pounds and I want the total number of nails. Now this gets a little tricky because number is really unitless. We don't have any unit here, so I'm going from some unit, pounds, to an actual pure counted number with no units, which we haven't really done before. So what that means is we've got to be really careful about our math and pay attention to what we're doing, pay attention to our answer, pay attention to our units. Okay, so our customer buys 2.60 pounds. We want the total number of nails. We need some conversion factors here. Here's my conversion factor between number and mass. A dozen nails, 1 dozen nails is equal to 0.150 pounds. Now, a dozen we know is 12, but this is actually not a number here. So we're going to get it into number 1 dozen is equal to 12 nails. I could express my answer as dozen, but we want to know our actual number. Okay, so let's look at our conversion factors here. I have pounds here, and here I have number. I'm going to put number in parentheses because there's not really a unit here. This is going to be a pure actual number. Here we have dozen, here we have dozen, here we have pounds, and here we have nails, which is going to be our number. So we've got our number here, as I said, is going to be really tricky because the only unit it's going to have is the identifier that we have, nails. 12 what? 12 nails. There's no measured unit such as pounds. Okay, so we're going to set up our railroad math the way we always do. We're going to start out with our given, 2.60 pounds, and then I'm going to use my conversion factor. I have pounds here. I must have pounds down in the denominator. So 1.05 pounds. And then the other half of my conversion factor is a dozen nails. I have dozen nails up here, so I need dozen down here. There's my 1. And 1 dozen nails is equal to 12 nails. Now look at our units. Our pounds are canceling out. Our nails are canceling out. Our dozens are. Sorry. Our dozen nails are canceling out. And what I'm left with is just nails. How many nails am I going to have? Okay, so then we let our calculator do the work. And my calculator tells me 208. So there we go. Now let's look at our sig figs. Here is our given measured value. Now this is going to be a little tricky because these are counted values and they're completely exact. So what's going to determine our final number of significant figures is the significant figures in our measured value. This is measured and this is measured. This has 3 sig figs, this has 3 sig figs. Our final answer should have 3 sig figs. So now let's think about this little everyday conversion that we looked at. We know that nails come in different sizes. If we bought a nail of a different size, would the mass of a dozen still be 0.150 pounds? And the answer, of course, is no. If it's a different size, the mass is going to be different. And clearly different nails could also have different compositions, which means their density would be different and their mass would be different as well. So now let's ask ourselves this question. Are there still 12 nails in a dozen? And the answer is yes. So the mass of a dozen of the 2 different types of nails will not be the same, but the number in a dozen will be the same. And because the mass of a dozen would change, there would not be 208 nails in 2.6 pounds, which is what we found here. So if we're looking at a nail that has a different mass, it's a different size, it's either smaller or larger, then this is the conversion factor that is going to change. And of course, it's going to impact our final answer.